Well, hello, all you fine folk. Welcome to another episode of the Genre Gals. I am a Hangry Tablet. I'm joined with Luina Wasserwoman and Lorna from that Park Place. Hello, ladies. How are you doing today?
I didn't agree to this.
Sorry. Okay.
Well, that's what happens when a bunch of good, honest, conservative sort of fellows decide to do a movie about drag shows. Well,
yes.
Not exactly about, but containing therein.
And
it was banned in Kansas.
Was it?
Did you know that?
Well,
because we don't do drag shows in Kansas.
I see. Well, we are going to be cranking the heat up a little. Did you see what I did there? And talking about Some Like It Hot, that classic Billy Wilder movie starring the one, the only Marilyn Monroe, and then two dudes who dressed up as women, I guess, for some reason. I don't know. No. Anyway, so this was a pretty fun movie. It was a film which had quite a lot of, well, as Lou was saying, controversy, banned in Kansas. I was not aware of that. But it generally was one that went over budget, that caused some controversy, that had, I think, Lou, you had mentioned the test audience walking out. And yet at the same time, this came out in 1959. On a budget of 2.9 million, it returned a box office of 49 million. So I guess somebody liked it. And it's considered one of the great classics. Correct me if I'm wrong there, gentlemen.
Yeah. And some people have voted it the funniest movie of all time. And that always kind of surprised me because I think it's a fun movie, but I don't think it's as knockdown, drag out, raucous laughter funny as a lot of people think it is. Not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it isn't that kind of movie. But Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis and Marilyn and all the other good people in it really put it together. Really put it together.
They did. And so on that note, for those of you in the audience who have not seen it, maybe Lou or Lauren, one of you could give us a quick overview of the story and the synopsis, please.
Maybe we should flip a coin, George Raft style. Lauren, you want to? Should I? What do you want to do?
I can take a crack at it if you want.
Go ahead.
Please.
So the story opens with a hearse that is making its way towards a funeral home, but is quickly pursued by a police car. And the gentlemen in the back of the hearse knock out the windows and start firing at the policemen, who fire back. There's a high-speed chase.
We should mention this is 1929 and
Correct.
during the heart of Prohibition and gangsterism in Chicago.
Yes. Yeah.
It is Chicago, and the hearse begins leaking. And it becomes pretty obvious that this is being used to smuggle liquor to a speakeasy that is inside the funeral home.
Mozzarella's funeral home.
Yep. And the police are preparing a raid on the joint. They have an informant who has given them the password to get in. This is Spats Columbo's speakeasy. And as we come in, we find that there's all kinds of people there enjoying their libations. There's a live jazz band that is populated with Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon playing Joe and Jerry, a saxophone player and a bass fiddle player, and bull fiddle, they call it. And the place gets raided. They make their way out before the place gets completely turned out. They avoid being arrested, and the cops are threatening that they're gonna bring Spats Columbo in. These guys, they're kind of hard up. They've got all kinds of debts that they've got to pay. They don't have very much money between them. They need another job quickly. They go to all of these various agents to find out, is there anywhere that we can get some work? And it turns out that there's really only one place that might have a job where they can get out of town and kind of lay low for a while, and it's in Florida. The catch is that it's an all-girl band, and their thinking at the time is that, well, maybe we could kind of finagle our way into this. We'll dress in women's clothes, we'll get out of town, and then once we hit Florida, we'll just kind of skip and figure out what we're going to do. But as it turns out, go ahead.
But Lauren, I think you forgot the part where the reason behind them needing to dress up as women.
Well,
it's because they witness Spats and his gang killing the other gang that gave them away.
Right, but that comes
in an event that really is, well, an imitation of the real St. Valentine's Day Massacre. They even put it on the same street as the real street where that garage was.
Or have I jumped the gun on this, Lorn? Sorry.
Yeah,
No.
yeah, that comes after. That's actually they have to borrow the gal's car, remember? And that's how they end up at the
Right.
garage. And so they end up, because they don't have any money, they sort of Tony Curtis has had this sort of a fling sort of with this secretary that he stood up previously, so she's not very happy with him. But he flirts with her and manages to get to borrow her car. And when they go to the garage, it turns out that this is also the mob-owned garage. And as they're fueling up the car, that's when Spats Columbo shows up to basically nail the informant, Toothpick Charlie. And they line them all up against the wall. They shoot him. And then, they have to get out of town and try and
Because
avoid
they're
the mob.
seen, and therefore they're witnesses, and therefore witnesses should not breathe anymore.
And
So-
they know them because they played in his club, so they recognize them. They know who these guys are. So the plan initially is to just kind of get out of town and then figure out what they're going to do. But of course, another member of this all-female jazz band is Marilyn Monroe. And that kind of changes the calculation somewhat. And what begins as sort of a love triangle turns into kind of something else entirely. And comic hijinks ensue from there.
Anyway, we should mention at this point a couple of things about what you've just heard. First of all, for some 6 degrees of Disneyfication, since I know you all love that, if you go back to the scene where the cop shows up at the speakeasy in the funeral home, and he's talking to the funeral director, although the guy playing him is listed and is an Italian bit part actor, that's not his voice.
Oh,
It's Paul Frees, aka the ghost host and the Pillsbury Doughboy and all the rest of it. And Paul Frees was employed on the movie for that, but also because there are later scenes where they decided Tony Curtis's voice wasn't quite soft enough, feminine enough. And so they blended it in the audio track with Paul Frees to modulate it up. So
really?
there's I was going to make note of which scene, but it's one of the ones in their room at the hotel where he's coming in to change clothes. Anyway, also, there is a joke in this movie that involves my doppelganger. The joke was that nobody mocked Lou Wasserman except Billy Wilder in this movie, because when they're looking for work and they're going to this office building full of theatrical agents to try and find work, there are various agencies with different names, but one of the doors says Music Corporation of America, Jules Stein, which is, of course, MCA, and Jules Stein was Lou Wasserman's mentor and was for real. And when they open the door, all that's in there is a lone secretary glugging away at a bottle of booze. And so apparently Billy Wilder played cards with Lou and thought it would be funny to put him by proxy through Jules Stein, his mentor, into the movie. So that.
What was Lou's reaction? Does anyone know? Or did
nobody
anyone ever
knows.
comment?
But
Okay.
obviously he didn't send a gang of Tommy gun guys over to Billy Wilder's house, so he must have been okay with it.
You see,
But
I saw that scene, and I was like, "There's something I'm missing here."
Mhm.
But it's neat that there was an in joke even back then in the 50s.
Oh, also, we might mention that supposedly when Ori Kelly, who was the costume designer on this and who was one of the most prolific costume designers in town, was measuring Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon and Marilyn Monroe for their outfits, said to Marilyn Monroe, quote, Tony Curtis has a nicer butt than yours.
Oh,
And Marilyn turned around, opened her shirt and said, yeah, but he hasn't got these. So...
yeah, and I mean, I gotta say, Marilyn's assets were very much on display for most of this film.
But the other thing is that apparently she was pregnant during the making of this movie, and that's why she looks a little heavier than she usually does. And supposedly, a lot of the publicity shots were another woman's body with her head stuck on it. So I don't know, but yeah. In fact, there's a story that there's later in the movie. There's a black all lace and beads outfit that she wears that she literally had to be sewn into rather than having traditional fasteners. And sometime, I think in the 70s, some guy found this black dress in a closet at his hotel, which was the Del Coronado where they shot this. And it was all black lace. And he went to an expert, and he got the room. The room was $50 a night. He took the dress home and got it verified as indeed being the dress she wore in that movie. And it sold for $200,000.
That's not a bad return.
No,
Wow.
not bad. Plus, you get to stay at the Del, which was a great place. But anyway, continue. I'm sorry. That gets us to Florida, basically, on the train.
Yes, continue, Lorn, please.
Well, from there, there's on the train ride over to Florida, Jack Lemmon is just beside himself, smitten with Marilyn, of course, and is contriving all kinds of ways to canoodle with her that, of course, end up being foiled in various comic ways. But once they get there, she kind of forms a relationship with Tony Randall, or Tony Curtis, rather. And what I thought was going to be more of a traditional love triangle actually shifts a little bit, because another character is introduced, who I believe is Charles Osgood III. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yes. I think that's the name. And
Joe E. Brown.
And I suppose you could say that Jack learns a few things about himself in the course of the.
The point is that they are discussing with Marilyn quite a bit that Florida at that time of year is where all the millionaires are, and that maybe they can find one and marry one and solve all their problems. Well, Mr. Osgood is indeed a millionaire, and Joe E. Brown, who was a wonderful comedian, plays that part, and he's ready for action, to say the least.
Yeah, he's definitely eager.
Any old action, in fact.
And in the meantime, you have Tony Curtis now working pretty hard to seduce Marilyn, although in yet another alter ego. He steals the clothes of, I guess, what would you call him? The
band
agent,
manager, the band manager.
Yeah.
There you go. And so he kind of adopts this, call it a millionaire sailing outfit.
It's a double-breasted yachting coat and a hat, and he puts on glasses.
And he contrives to meet Marilyn on the beach. And kind of what's interesting about this is apparently he based his performance on Cary Grant,
right?
Which is where his accent comes from. And he passes himself off as a Shell Oil executive, and he contrives to sort of use Jack to get Charles Osgood III off of his yacht so that he can make use of it while passing himself off as this rich
billionaire.
Yeah. And again, you just have a series of hijinks that ensue there. But what becomes interesting is that after a certain amount of time has passed, you have the Friends of the Italian Opera Club meeting at the hotel. And
I love that.
Of course, this is Spats Colombo and his gang. And
it's all the Italian gangsters from all around the country, led by... what is it, Little Caesar or something like that?
Little Bonaparte.
Little Bonaparte.
With
who many people thought was contrived to look like Mussolini.
With the best line ever, where he said something along the lines of, "So I've been ever since I've nominated myself as the leader of the organization last 5 years ago, we've been doing quite well, and I think you all made a very good choice in that."
Yeah.
Yeah, and the conflict here is that Little Bonaparte was good friends with Matchstick Charlie, and because Spats Colombo offed him, there's now some tension here at this meeting. Now, Spats also has designs on leadership of the various families, and is kind of contriving to bump him off too. But things don't exactly go to plans, and eventually all things are resolved, as things are in these kind of screwball comedies, but not exactly the way that I expected that they were going to be. And I'm kind of curious what you. Well, I thought that the big triangle was going to be between Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis and Marilyn, and that plot point kind of got sidelined once they introduced Charles Osgood. The rest of the stuff with the mob resolves pretty much the way that you would expect, but I guess that you would say the love triangle didn't. And that kind of plays into how I guess Jack sort of discovers a few things about himself. And that was one of the surprises for the movie for me. We've talked before when we deal with these older films about the Hays Code during this time.
Right.
I felt like they got away with quite a lot in this
Well,
movie.
in fact, this is one of the movies that has been said led to the end of the Hays Code when they let this one go.
And just
Not only did Kansas ban it, but the Catholic League of Decency banned it too.
and for those listeners who hadn't heard before, what the Hays Code is, what exactly?
Well, it was an industry self-imposed censorship board, kind of the precursor of the ratings letters now. But the idea was that if you didn't have one overall authority to keep things within certain boundaries, you had all these local censorship boards in every city and town and in every church who might ban it here, not ban it there, take a different version here, a different version there. And if the studios had to recut the movie 43 ways from Sunday in order to get it everywhere, it was going to be a losing proposition financially. They wanted it to be the same story, the same print, the same movie everywhere. So they invented this thing, and it was a judge whose last name was Hayes, who they chose to be the boss of it. And anyway, it fell by the wayside right around this time.
Yeah, I was actually quite surprised at how much they got away with in this movie, and it also was kind of comforting in a way because it brought home to me the fact that while I wouldn't call this a teenage sex comedy, it's kind of in the same vein, and it's like they've always been there, and they're kind of similar in the way that they make their jokes. It's kind of a timeless trope, and that made it a lot of fun.
By the way, there are more casting anomalies in this thing, really amazing ones, frankly. For one thing, the natural choice to play the head of the mafia organization would have been Edward G. Robinson, and they wanted him, but he had years ago somehow come a cropper with Billy Wilder and said he would never, ever work for him.
Oh.
But guess who's in the movie? The young guy who's doing the George Raft coin flip business at the entrance and taking everybody's guns away and who pops out of the cake later, that's Edward G. Robinson Jr.
Oh.
That's strange. Why did he not want to work with Billy Wilder?
Apparently they had some knockdown fist fight at some point over something, and I don't know. He just said he'd never work with him again. So also the people who could have been in this, I mean, everybody and their brother was considered. First of all, Marilyn Monroe didn't want to do the movie because she said, I don't want to be seen as a woman who can't tell if a guy is a guy or a girl. And the other thing was that Marilyn's contract said that all of her movies had to be in color. And originally they were going to shoot this in color. But when they did the makeup tests on Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon dressed up as girls, the colors from the exaggerated makeup made their faces look green somehow on film. And so when they showed it to her, she agreed to go with the black and white. Frank Sinatra was going to be in the movie, but he didn't show up for an interview. Jerry Lewis was going to be in one of the parts and turned it down. All kinds of people were considered for this thing, and especially when you consider it is not really a direct adaptation of any particular source. There was an old German movie, apparently, but nobody could find it. They just sort of knew the story. And so...
and it was Billy Wilder who wrote the script. With
Billy Wilder and his often collaborator, I.A.L. Diamond, whose son Paul went to high school with me, but that's another story.
Oh,
see, 6 degrees of Louisification, I guess you'd have to call that. But anyway, and Billy Wilder had made a previous movie with Marilyn, and they did not get along. And so when they got her to do this anyway, he knew she was trouble because, well, frankly, she was a pretty fragile personality, and she was often using drugs. And they figured that she cost this movie over $500,000 in not showing up on time or not being ready or not doing her lines. In fact, supposedly, there was one line that she was supposed to do that she never quite got right for something like 47 takes.
Yeah, like 50 something. Yeah.
And and then somebody asked him after this, would he ever make another movie with Marilyn? And he said, quote, My doctor and my psychiatrist tell me I'm too old and too rich to go through this again.
But he also didn't invite her to the cast party, which she was quite sad about.
But later, and she said she called his house and he wasn't there, and his wife answered the phone and she said, "Please give your husband my message. Go blank yourself."
Yeah.
But then later, she wanted to do another movie with him, Irma la Douce, that was eventually done by Shirley MacLaine. And at a premiere, she threw her arms around him and told him how much she loved the picture and whispered she'd like to play the lead in Irma la Douce. So
Didn't work out too well, though.
Yeah, well, sad story. But lots of talent, but messed up.
Yeah,
Anyway.
and I mean, I've got to say, for all the trouble that Marilyn Monroe caused, casting her, I think, was the genius choice, because I feel a lot of guys probably wouldn't have gone and seen this movie without the
Well,
pull
that's
of
true.
Marilyn
If you told a man, "Hey, you want to go see a movie where two men dress up as women?" his first thought would be, "No, I don't want to even think that's what I want to see." Back in that period, and well, it worked.
Yeah.
And the standby, the person who they were going to use if they couldn't get Marilyn, was Mitzi Gaynor, who would have been great. But anyway, so continue, I guess, with the story. I don't know why I interrupted in the middle, but I did.
No, I think we pretty well wrapped the plot.
Yeah, basically, they keep changing roles and changing back and forth. And then, of course, the bad guys recognize them and chase them all over the hotel. And the happily ever after ending is that the four of them, Marilyn and Osgood and or Joey Lewis, Joey Ross, and of course Jack Lemmon, they all are happily ever after on the yacht. But Lemmon feels like he has to finally confess. And he turns to the zillionaire and says, I can't marry you. And he says, "Why not?" He says, "Because I'm a man."
Well, he gives all kinds of reasons.
Yeah, he's leading all up to that, like smoking habit, infertility.
And he keeps saying, "Well, that's not a big deal. We'll adopt." And then finally he says, "I'm a man." And he says, "Well, nobody's perfect."
Nobody's perfect, right?
I think my favorite line in the movie is actually when Jack Lemmon first encounters Marilyn Monroe and he's exclaiming about her to Tony Curtis and says, "She's like Jello on springs."
Yes.
I thought that was a great line.
But it was how did you guys feel about the resolution between Marilyn Monroe and Tony Curtis at the end, though, where she basically forgave him for 2 substantial deceptions?
Well, love conquers all.
Yes.
It's not a documentary. It's a farce. Right. It's a romance. So
yes. So it had to have a happy ending.
But it was received. The story is that they did a preview screening and the audience booed. They thought it was terrible.
Yeah. And
the studio came to him and suggested different things to cut. And I forget which of the stars asked him, "What are you going to do?" And he said, "Nothing." He said, "I think it's a great film. It's perfect the way it is. And maybe we got a bad audience on a bad night." And the next time they previewed it, it got raves, and the rest is history. It was voted the best comedy film of all time in a poll of 253 film critics from 52 countries by the BBC in 2017, which, like I say, I think it's good. I think it's fun. I think it's nice, but I don't think it's the funniest movie of all time. But that's just me. Oh, here's another 6 degrees. When they're getting on the train in Chicago for Florida, and the announcers living on track 1 for Washington, Charleston, Savannah, Jacksonville, and Miami, all aboard. Guess who it is? You never see him, but then you never see him in the place you know him better anyway. Jack Wagner, who is and has been the voice of not just the trains, but the parades and everything else at Disneyland for 1,000,000 years. So there you go. And that was interesting. Supposedly, Billy Wilder saw Tony Curtis when he was making Houdini in 1953, and he thought he'd be perfect because he said, "I was sure Tony was right for it because he was quite handsome." And when he tells Marilyn Monroe that he's one of the Shell Oil family, she has to be able to believe it. So the casting theories in this thing, and then I didn't catch it, but apparently as a nod to Public Enemy, in the banquet scene when Spats Columbo comes close to smashing a henchman in the face with a grapefruit, the way that Jimmy Cagney did to Mae Clark in that famous movie. So he put a lot of fun stuff in here. By the way, the original title of the movie was Not Tonight, Josephine, which is an old Napoleon joke. But
well, gentlemen, now is the part of the show where we put on our intersectional hats and we examine this movie through the lens of modern culture.
Do we do that every?
I'm kidding.
Is this the lens culture segment of the show? I remember.
Yes, the intersectionality.
Before you do that, though, all I was going to say was, of course, this was turned into a Broadway musical called Sugar in 1972. And it was Robert Morse and Tony Roberts and Elaine Joyce. And it ran for 505 performances, which is pretty darn good. Okay. And then they toured it around the country. Anyway.
So, okay, in all seriousness, you look at a movie like this and you think to yourself, like, perhaps you almost feel like this is progressiveness done right in a sense. And what I mean by that is it's like drag queens without the hard sexual elements to it. And it becomes a funny film. It becomes a funny, sympathetic movie. And I don't know if I'm making much sense here when I say this, but
I'm just kidding.
Okay, thank you.
Well, let me tell you where you're off. And with all respect, you know that.
All right.
The drag queen, as we know them today, is somebody overtly pushing a sexual message.
Yes.
This movie has none of that.
It
really doesn't.
That's what I was trying to say.
Is they are literally going to get shot to death if they don't do this. That's a pretty good motivator. Better than flashing your junk at somebody. Let's put it that way. And drag queens, as we think of them, and even drag performers back in the day when it wasn't quite as overt, are trying to achieve an exaggeration of femininity. This was not. These guys were trying to blend in as women. Well, in fact, they mentioned that a real drag performer was brought in to teach Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon how to walk in high-heeled shoes. And after about a week or so, Jack Lemmon told him, thanks, but no thanks. I don't want to do the part as a man who perfectly walks in female clothing. I want to do the part as a man who can't do it very well. In other words, getting better at it was worse for the part, which makes sense if you think about it.
Right.
That is the gag, is that if you look at that picture right there, there is no way these two guys would ever pass as women. That's what makes this funny, is that nobody notices this.
Well, and in some ways, in the context of the all-girl band, they're just another couple of the girls. If they were off by themselves, it might not be so successful or so believable. So
I don't know, man. I think you'd have to have pretty bad eyesight and pretty bad hearing to not catch up.
I'm saying if you were told, hey, look at them, where do you think they are? You're right. But if they're just part of the hoi polloi,
well, they had to film it in black and white. But
I'm talking about the girls of the band themselves. It's like I'm pretty sure they'd sniff that out.
Yeah.
But
to coin a phrase.
Watching this, it felt like watching Bugs Bunny dressed up as a woman trying to, trick Elmer Fudd or.
Well, he did a couple of times. Once, as if I remember right, he did Carmen Miranda with the fruit bonnet and all the rest of it. So
I mean that was.
Oh, and by the way, Danny Kaye and Bob Hope were considered for the two parts. That would have been interesting.
And so I wonder if, continuing on in this sort of vein, would make this a bit more, how do I put this, socially acceptable, or having more people be accepted, more actually truly progressive than a lot of the stuff we see in film and television these days, which, as you have rightly pointed out, is a lot more overt.
Well, I'm just saying that their motivation for doing it is not to pretend to be another sex for sexual reasons.
Right.
It's a disguise.
Yeah.
It's a fancier version of a mustache and a hat and a fake scar. So the fact that that then leads to romance is the joke, because it puts them in in the same sleeping compartment on a train with Marilyn Monroe, for God's sakes. And the point being, if they were gay, they wouldn't get turned on by her.
That's true.
I think looking at it from our current, if I may be so bold, madness is probably a red herring to some degree. But,
okay, so I guess we're gonna put a.
That's what I think. But you may think differently, and that's swell. But
we're gonna put a pin in our intersectional segment of the show now. I guess that was the first and last time we do it.
Careful with those pins. There's.
I always get the fuzzy end of the lollipop. I tells you.
Oh yeah, that's a line from the movie. Everybody. Yeah.
But I mean, I gotta say, again, for all of the reported trouble that she caused and the budget overruns and the 50 takes for a single line and so on and so forth. Wow. Marilyn Monroe is a presence.
Yes, she was. Yes, she was. She was an original, unlike anybody.
Wow.
Well, I think the most amazing part of her performance in a way is that she plays that ditzy blonde role with that hint of innocence when there's obviously a lot not so innocent about her. She does that perfectly, and there's a cleverness in carrying that kind of performance is what I think made her brilliant in this.
And the character perfectly acknowledges she's not the brightest person in the room and has made her peace with it and found a way to use it to her benefit, which you have to respect. Most people like that you or I would meet in the world, and I've met a few, are trying very hard to prove that they're not dumb bunnies, are trying very hard to prove that they are, rocket scientists, and in the process proving the reverse.
Yeah.
This character, this lady named Sugar, is saying, you know what? I am what I am. Thank God I can sing and play a ukulele. I can find some work. And I drink too much, and that's life. And a lot of sax players done me wrong. It's
because it's the sax.
But there's a frankness about her, an honesty about her that is what's unexpected in a woman who's so physically a presence.
Well, you need to explain that sax comment.
Oh, well, he plays the saxophone, and she keeps telling him how, being a band singer and ukuleleist, how she's basically been done wrong for some reason. She goes for guys who play the sax, and all of them are stinkers who just go on to the next grove. And
it's
so
she's been sort of the sax.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why he doesn't want to tell her he plays the saxophone, because he's afraid that'll be the end of the story. But once she's gotten to know him, albeit in a fake role, but understands what he's gone through to maintain that fake role because he cares about her, she says, well, maybe I found the right one now, and goes on from there.
And that's actually his character arc, because his intentions originally are not noble.
Exactly.
But when it comes right down to it, he decides, I have to break this off with her. He could have just left, and he didn't. Instead, he called her. He made up a BS excuse about why he had to leave.
Right.
But he tried to let her down gently. He even arranged for her to be, at least for the short term, financially taken care of.
Right.
That's something that prior to his experience with her, he wouldn't have done. And so it's actually kind of a sweet little character arc for him.
She redeems him as much as he redeems her, so to speak. These are good people who are dealing with life as it's been dealt to them. And
it feels like another thing. It feels like another world. I mean, looking at this film, especially at the beginning, with prohibition, with that society, with people trying to find work, with basically no social safety net, all of this, you look at it and you think, like, it almost feels like this was another planet in a way.
I disagree. I think in some ways it felt strangely familiar. But I think part of that is because society, in a way, is in a place where I don't think anybody feels like there are any guarantees. We may have a social safety net, but I think we're in somewhat perilous times, and there's all kinds of debates about all kinds of things in society. We're not exactly dealing with prohibition, but we're dealing with other things. And I think
But we're certainly dealing with crime, however disorganized.
Yep.
Yes.
And I think, that's the point really of, and by the way, it was Wilder who put this in that era. The original story was not, and who put this whole Chicago and gangster and Valentine's Day Massacre thing into the movie. And he did that, I think, to give them a real, actual, believable fear that leads them to do this. He was saying they wouldn't do this if it was just, well, we got to get out of town and skip on our hotel bill. But the fact that they could get blasted away, and the fact that, frankly, for a quote unquote comedy, the violence is pretty substantial.
It is.
It isn't just pistols, it's Tommy guns, for God's sakes. And everywhere they go, we see the holes in his base that the bullets made to remind us that there's real danger out there for them.
And they use that to identify him too. So
yeah.
And if you watch the original trailer for this, it actually calls out in the trailer that it leads with action, which was kind of surprising too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Except that if you advertised it as a philosophical treatise on sexual roles in the modern era, nobody would go.
Darn it, that's what I was going for. Well, guys,
that's I remember, Pinky and the Brain, and those things where he says, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking, Pinky?" There's a whole compilation of those answers that Pinky gives to Brain, and one of them says, "I think so, Brain, but if we called them sad meals, the children wouldn't want them."
So on that note, gentlemen, let's do our classic. What did you like? What didn't you like about this? And I'm going to start with you, Lorn.
Well, I do not think that Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon make convincing women at all. So,
and they thank you, and their parents thank you.
I'm sure. But it was a sweet little movie that I enjoyed, and I actually found myself laughing quite a bit. I think primarily because there were lines that got in there that I didn't think would, and I thought some of them were pretty clever. It was a sweet movie. I liked the people involved. I think it was a good time. I enjoyed it.
Lou?
Anything you didn't like?
The only thing that I could really think of, there was one point where I was thinking to myself, if these guys are so hard up for cash, and they've had to hawk their overcoats just to try and get themselves out of the situation that they're in. I was trying to figure out, where did they get all the women's clothes and makeup and stuff? And the only answer that I could come up with is, well, maybe they raided the secretary for that too, but I don't know. That was the only real thing that I could.
Well, if you want to look at it totally logically and take yourself out of it, and of course, that's part of Wilder's skill, is to keep all those plates juggling on those sticks so you don't pay attention to stuff like that.
Yep.
What about you, Lou?
Well, look, the performances, of course, are really, really magical. And I think the fact that they're all, you can believe Tony and Jack as friends, but there's a friction there all the way through that works for this. And you can believe them being attracted to Marilyn Monroe physically, but there's a sweetness in her that takes their admiration to a more of a friendship level that's nice too. I think the way these characters are played off against each other, and the genius of saying, well, if you're starting off with two guys in dresses and wigs and a girl with big boobs, where do you go from there if they're the baseline? And the answer to that is Joe E. Brown, George Raft, Pat O'Brien as the cop, is that you have to take everybody else another step further. Mike Mazurki, all those old-time gangster guys, because playing against them, it makes our heroes look normal in a way, That's the skill of the storytelling. By the way, most people don't know that George Raft was a famously good dancer. And I read that he spent time with Tony Curtis and Joey Brown teaching them the tango so they could do those scenes, because he was an expert. So anyway, also, by the way, set design, I'm looking at that shot there of inside the boat, and some really, really luxuriously great stuff going on. As I was saying to Tablette, before we started, the only part about it for me, as somebody who has spent many stays at that hotel, the Del Coronado in San Diego, it's a shame that their interior sets in the movie aren't as good as the real thing.
Yeah,
It's
you're mentioning that.
gorgeous. It's just beautiful. It's all, at one time, I believe it was officially the largest all wood structure in North America.
Wow.
And McKinley was there, and Teddy Roosevelt was there, and the if you go there and you see these crown, the logo of the place is a crown because Coronado means the crown, and these huge chandeliers in the dining room that are in the shapes of crowns. Those were designed by L. Frank Baum, the guy who wrote The Wizard of Oz, who was also a bit of an illustrator, because he hung out there quite a bit. I think he actually lived in Coronado. But Coronado is the island in the bay at San Diego. It's largely about Navy people. It's the Navy base, and in World War II, it was the Navy base of the West Coast, really, even more so than San Francisco. But anyway, yeah, it's a charming movie, and it didn't have to be that charming without such a skilled storyteller involved in making it happen. So that's my admiration for it.
So I will say, I wasn't a big fan of Tony Curtis's accent as the billionaire, but that's pretty much my only criticism of it. I enjoyed the film. I thought it was fun. It felt like, as Lorn, you kind of mentioned, a bit like the American Pie of the 1950s in a way. And, you know, what I liked about it, I mean, Marilyn Monroe. I mean, gosh. I really,
no more.
You say no more, basically.
She was a lot of girl. She was a whole lot of girl, no doubt about it.
Good gravy. And I'm sure I'm going to get roasted on that during our next intersectional analysis. But all that to be said, this was
another one. You didn't learn from this one. You're persistent. I'll give you that.
Thank you. Well, I mean, on that note, audience, do you want us to start doing intersectional analysis of these films? Did you like Some Like It Hot? Have you seen it? Did you find it hot enough? Are there any other Marilyn Monroe films that you might particularly recommend? Leave us your comments. Leave us your thoughts down below. We'd love to hear from them, as always. And gentlemen, this was a lot of fun. You know, we didn't have to put on women's clothing for this, which is very thankful for that. Thank you. And on that note, I hope you all have a wonderful evening and go watch the film.
We hope you enjoyed that special presentation of The Genre Guys here on 23PO. Be sure to subscribe to this channel for more content like it. And if you want to enjoy every episode of The Genre Guys as soon as they are released, be sure to become a member at WW Pro's YouTube channel. What were your thoughts on this amazing film? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you so much for watching. T3PO. Please comment, like, and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe to That Park Place Podcasts Online, your source for exclusive content and highlights from WDW Pro, The Pro Show, and That Park Place for all the news that should be fun.